They can.
As best they can.
But they all bring the same deficit in terms of understanding what city life is like and not having a support
And
network.
they learn quickly. They become very streetwise. I mean, my young friend is now 24. He's been on his own since he was 7, and he's my link to other street kids. And so he knows what life is like for them because he's lived through it. And so we're trying to support him in what he can do, but it's extremely difficult. And often, when they're given an opportunity, which is very limited, but if they're given an opportunity to go into some program and have some, you know, safe haven and some food on a regular basis, they end up going back on the streets anyway because it's what they know and it's what they can trust.
I know Susanna wanted to get into the conversation.
You know, Chaba is supporting 5 projects in Burundi and Rwanda. And the African, we've seen over the years, the African way is to accept orphans. There used to, I have a quote that I've read that there used to be no orphans in Africa because families would just take in, but now the numbers are so great. So as families take in more children, their own financial resources drop, and in these countries that are so poor, there's not a social network. There's nothing. There are no resources.
And you know, by saying that, that opens the door. And I've got to ask Teresa, the current state of the economy in Zimbabwe and the inflation that's going on there, how does that exacerbate the plight of these AIDS orphans?
Well, one of the things, talking back into challenges of what faces the children who are living in these resource-limited communities is that some of the children end up putting themselves in places of risk, like going into prostitution, for instance. And it's not just limited to children, it's even teachers are choosing to prostitute themselves rather than because they are not getting paid enough with the school, through the school system. So now you end up having leaders, people who are supposed to be leaders, people who are supposed to be looking, where children are supposed to be looking up to, are now choosing prostitution as a form of feeding their own family. And so HIV is really affecting people in a way that has never been seen before in terms of economically, because before a teacher in our community, particularly in the rural areas, a teacher in the community was the leader.
Was the person who was getting. All of you are nodding in agreement. Yes. We're seeing this across the board.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then let me get to the issue of the situation, the economic situation, the inflation situation in Zimbabwe, and how does that then exacerbate this plight of the children?
Well, go ahead.
One of the things I found when I was recently in Zimbabwe is they found that the orphans' babies in the trash can. This way, they couldn't take care of them. There wasn't the money, the resources, and this is one of the problems we have, is they were finding them in the trash can, or they were finding where the girls were kicked out of their home because the father and the brother were raping them because they thought there was a cure for AIDS, and that is not true.
So there was no safety even in their own home once the mother passed.
Right. And it's not only the economic problem, it's educating the government in terms of effective policies and programs to address some of these issues.
But don't you think that there's still some of this lack of knowledge amongst those on the government side, so they continue to propagate?
That's right. That's right.
The wrongdoing against these children.
That's right.
Because one of the, in April, UNICEF put out a report in Zimbabwe that child rape had risen to 42% due to the economic crisis. Parents are finding themselves so overwhelmed that they don't know what else to do, and some of them tend to raping their own children.
You know, that's its own documentary, which Diane is probably already thinking about doing in picture. But vis-a-vis the education, the profession, the opportunities for these AIDS orphans, do they have any opportunity to go to school and further education?
In the countries where we've worked, there are variations by country. In Rwanda, they have a universal primary education policy, but in actuality, it doesn't work. So we're raising funds to send children to primary school. Only 14% of the secondary age students go to secondary school. So schooling is their only opportunity. but still there are over 30 million children in sub-Saharan Africa not in primary school. It's improved over the last years, but it is nowhere near the universal primary that
But
the
they're trying
world
to
has
survive.
called
How do you
for.
get to school?
One family that I spent time with, they had 12 children. One grandma who at the age of 40 was taking care of 12 kids. And one child was going to school.
Yeah.
And, you know, and then we ended up needing to raise money for that one kid to go to school. And the rest of the kids were out in the fields working. They were, you know, picking through the beans after they were taken in, and just absolutely on a survival level day to day.
And children know if they're not in school, they have no hope. They know that
That's right.
clearly.
That's right.
First they want food, then they want to go to school.
Yes.
And they behave in school.
And in school, the
They
school
work hard.
also ends up being a solace for some of these children. It's
Right.
where they can find
Yes.
a little bit of hope. And at the same time, particularly in Zimbabwe, which I think is also in most African countries, where some traditions that were there in the beginning are now coming to play. For instance, where parents have to choose to educate a boy over a girl. So most of the girls are now also being disfranchised that way as well, because a parent has to think, okay, out of the two children, if I can afford to send anybody to school, it's going to be a boy, because there's this expectation that once the boy is educated, he's going to take care of the rest of the family.
And the intra-relationship of this. For example, AIDS are not only affecting children, but affecting the educators. So teachers, you don't have the professional services and the educators, because they are also dying of AIDS.
Right. Now that we've really touched on the worldview, what about New York State? Well, here are a couple of facts. Since the beginning of the epidemic, community-based organizations and other state agencies have come together to implement programs and policies that possibly have saved nearly 700,000 children from becoming orphans. In addition, the number of mother-to-child HIV transmissions has significantly been reduced. In 2007, it was reported only 8 children born to mothers with HIV were born with the infection. These efforts have undoubtedly placed New York State in a position to lead and share the lessons that have been learned over the last 2.5 decades. With that said, each of our panel members is currently working on community-based projects that speak to the HIV epidemic. So let's work our way around the table and discover how each of them became involved and what some of those projects are.
Rotary works at the City Mission. There are programs at the City Mission that help mothers that are having children that they have found out have AIDS. And we are working with them through Rotary clubs to make sure that they have a place if something happens to their mother.
It's a great opportunity for outreach. Teresa, are you working on the state level too?
No, actually, but I'm going to let Ms. Gamble answer that question.
Because I know you've been
think she
involved,
has
and you touched on it in the first segment. Yeah.
Benita, if I would have thought in the late 80s that I would be working with women affected by HIV, I would have said never.
Why?
Because that just wasn't my direction. It wasn't what I had gone to school for. It was never what I had imagined for myself. However, the first time I went and met a mom who had recently been diagnosed, not with HIV, but with AIDS in the hospital. And I made up in my mind what I thought this first meeting was going to be about and how she would be so focused on her recent diagnosis. And I walked into her home, and her first question to me was, who's going to take care of my child? And I was so struck by that because I was a new mother. My daughter was about 2 years old at that time. And I wondered to myself, would that be the first question I would ask if I had gotten that kind of diagnosis? And from that day, I never looked back. And the women that I have had the honor of working with have just made such an impact on my life, because it wasn't about them. It was always about their children and their families.